Welcome to another episode of Defending the Line. I'm Christy Shepard, and this is my podcast to share the story of what happened in the murder of my cousin Debbie Carter in our small Oklahoma town, and how finding out the men convicted of that crime were innocent turned into a quest for truth and accountability. In the last episode, I mentioned that there was always seemed to be this cloud of unfinished business when it came to Debbie's case. And where we're at this point, you know, if you read John Grisham's book, The Innocent Man, this is kind of where that story ends. And even if you watch the Netflix series, it seems as though Gore only, you know, he had a trial and was sent to prison. And if you haven't read the book or seen the series, I would highly recommend both. Certainly, Mr. Grisham's book is, you know, a much more intimate, you know, detailed account of what Ron experienced. And there actually is another book called Journey Toward Justice that Dennis Fritz wrote, and it's, you know, his account and, you know, his viewpoint of what all had happened. But by now we're, I guess, almost about 2 years since Glenn Gore has, you know, taken up residence on Oklahoma's death row, when another headline hits the paper. And it was that the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals would hear Gore's appeals. And here we were again in this place of believing that, you know, everything was settled, that there wasn't really any issues, and that Gore's appeals just seemed kind of, you know, like the court's hearing that just seemed like a part of the process. And again, our belief in the criminal justice system was, you know, it was rock solid. And we even had this added assurance of DNA this time. The special prosecutor, Richard Winery, who had prosecuted Glenn Gore in his trial, was quoted in the paper saying, "I don't see the court reversing this conviction. Judge Landreth tried an extremely clean case. He was really an exceptional judge. The law and the facts of the case are foursquare against Gore." But within a few months, there was another headline that, for whatever reason, really kind of rattled my cage. And I guess, you know, looking back, maybe that was one of the first times I began to feel like kind of nervous about what might happen next. And the headline was, "Evidence Reexamined. DNA on Jeans Belongs to Debbie Sue Carter Tested." And I guess they were doing some DNA testing on her jeans that had not been previously tested in 1999. And I called Peppy and talked to her about it, and was just kind of talking about, you know, our concerns. And it was even also stated in the article that someone from the Attorney General's office was quoted saying, like, this won't make any difference. Like, this testing won't, you know, it doesn't change anything. But mine and Peppy's conversation turned to the rumors that were swirling about town that John Grisham was going to write a book about Ron Williamson. And at this point, there were just as many people, or probably more, saying, like, that will never happen. That's ridiculous. That's just, a rumor. And we'd heard that, George Clooney had bought the rights to the book. And, but like I said, there were just as many people saying that was just craziness. But a few days later, Peppy called and had asked me if I would come over and just sit with her and kind of be there for moral support, because Court TV had called and wanted to do an interview with her. And I, of course, told her yes, and went over there, because sometimes she would get embarrassed, if she got flustered or, started to cry. So this 3-person crew from Court TV arrives at Peppy's house, and they, started setting everything up and finding the perfect place for her to sit. And I remember they turned off the refrigerator and turned off the air conditioner, and it was like in the middle of summer. So the microphones wouldn't, pick up noise. And the interview took most of the day, and Peppy really held it together and did better probably than she had anticipated. And they even asked me a few questions, but for most of the interview, I just kind of sat on the end of the couch and took it all in. But what struck me the most about this interview were the questions that the producer asked Peppy. And it was though she already knew the answers to the questions, but Peppy didn't. And when the crew began to, pack up their stuff that day and move everything out, Peppy had gone outside to smoke and kind of, collect her nerves. And the producer was sitting there finishing up her notes. And so I took the opportunity to sit down with her and kind of, just ask her, like, had she heard these rumors about John Grisham writing a book? And she looked at me and said, that is not a rumor. That is a done deal. And I remember kind of being taken back a little that she was like so certain, like she knew about this. And so I asked her also about some of the questions that she had asked Peppy. And it really kind of landed heavy on me that there were way more people knew about what had really happened in Debbie's case than her own family. And the producer asked me if I had ever read a book by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld called Actual Innocence. And I had not. And remember, Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld were some of the Innocence Project attorneys that worked on Williamson and Fritz's case. But anyway, Peppy and I, when the crew left, we sat out on her back porch and kind of, sat in the swing and just talked about the day and how things had gone. And I let her know that the producer had told me that it was very much true that Ron Williamson was going to write a book that John Grisham was going to write a book about Ron Williamson's case. And that wasn't something that was going to happen. That was something that was happening. That was very much underway. And, I told Peppy, I said, people are going to talk about Debbie, and there's nothing that we can do about that. But maybe we better be the ones talking. Because if if we're not the ones talking about her, they're going to say whatever they want to. And, we'd seen enough over the years of her being reduced to this, barmaid. And Peppy, I remember she said, "Well, sugar, you just do whatever you think's right. I know you'll do a good job for Debbie." But I had no idea what that job would be. I had no idea, where I would even start. But then the next day I went to, at the time we had a local, like a Hastings book and movie store, and I went and looked for this actual Innocence book, and they didn't have it, but they ordered it for me. And in a few days it came in, and I rushed down there to pick it up. And I remember sitting in my car and flipping through the pages, because I didn't know these people, or names or anything. So I was flipping through the pages till I found names I recognized. And there was this chapter entitled Snitch. And what they were referring to is the woman that had claimed she heard Ron Williamson confess. And that woman's name was Terry Holland. And I didn't know until I read this book that Terry Holland had landed back in the county jail at the same time that Ron had been brought back to Ada to be released. She was there again at the same time with him, which was kind of strange. And the next, several pages just kind of ran down the case, nothing that I didn't know. But they got back to explaining more about Terry Holland and this miraculous chain of events, and how this woman was the same person who heard the confession of Carl Fontenot in the 1984 murder of Denise Haraway, who was, the woman who was killed about 15 months after Debbie. And I was kind of blown away. Like, I had no idea that she was the same person. So this woman ends up in the county jail at the same time as these, men, and is privy to these, case-breaking confessions. But what was odd was that the book had said that in 1986 that this Holland had moved to New Mexico, but that our local county sheriff's office extradited her back to Oklahoma for some bad checks. So they chased this woman down all the way in New Mexico and brought her back. And it was during her jail time in 1986 that she suddenly remembered this confession that she heard from Ron Williamson in 1984. And I really could not wrap my mind around her involvement in any of this. I mean, when you see it and kind of read it broken down to where she was, and again, just this chain of events of how she was where she was, it really kind of blew my mind. But as I read further, there began these paragraphs of describing the cells on Oklahoma's, the holding cells on Oklahoma's death row. And as I read it down a little further, I felt like the air had just been sucked out of me. There was a quote in the book that says, Ron, came their taunting voices on the intercom. This is Debbie Carter. Why did you kill me? I did not kill Debbie Carter, Ron would scream from his cells for hours on end. I did not kill Debbie Carter. I'm an innocent man. And I thought back on my visit to death row and how they told us about how the guards could control the pods and speak to the prisoners, in their cells from the intercom system. And I thought of all the clients that I'd had, with severe mental illness, and seeing the struggles that they lived with. And in my mind, I could see Williamson screaming in that cell, just losing his mind. And I thought back to how I stood and stared at his cell door, wishing him all the hell that he deserved. And I started to cry and just sit in the truth that he had received every bit of hell that I wished on him. And that I'd gotten exactly what I asked for. And, I had to live with that. And that's very humbling to not just dislike someone, but to truly wish bad things on them, and then to find out that that actually happened. But then that it wasn't deserved. And a page or so later, I read that there was a 2-hour videotape statement from Williamson denying that he had ever had anything to do with Debbie's murder, and that was never presented at trial. And so, again, here was another huge piece of the puzzle that was never brought up. And there was more in the book. There was a quoted conversation that took place between Glenn Gore and one of Williamson's other attorneys, a man by the name of Mark Barrett. And Mr. Barrett had gone to the prison where, Gore was being held and questioned him about his testimony placing Ron at the coach lot the night Debbie was murdered. And this conversation takes place before Ron and Dennis were released, and when Glenn was still in prison for the kidnapping of his ex-wife. And so Mark is asking him about, this testimony, and he says, this is Glenn's quote in the book, says, "The DA told me he'd go after me if I didn't stick it to Ron and Dennis," Gore stated. Peterson told me if things don't go right, we are coming after you, Gore claimed. And it continues on about more of the conversation and how the attorneys gave Gore a Q-tip and asked him if he would give them a saliva sample. And they were also explaining to him how there was DNA in Debbie's case that had come back. And so, they asked him if he would give a saliva sample. And there was some bantering back and forth about, the Q-tip. But then Gore snaps the Q-tip in half and cleans his ears with it and then places it in his pocket and took the Q-tip with him. And I continued to just sit in my car and reading these bits and pieces. Again, realizing that we knew absolutely nothing about all that had taken place. And kind of feeling like I was in the twilight zone reading these conversations and this maneuvering, and like we had no idea that any of this had happened. And the snitch chapter was coming to an end, and the authors recounted, this friendly, relaxing scene between Judge Landreth and the defense attorneys and the assistant district attorney at the time, Chris Ross, and the district attorney, Bill Peterson. And this was on the afternoon before Williamson and Fritz were released. And it says that Mr. Scheck asked Ross about reliability and jailhouse snitches in light of the DNA. And the conversation is quoted in the book saying, Ross asked, "Do you mean Terry?" "Yeah," said Barry. "Terry Holland. What about her?" "Well," Ross said, grinning, "we like to say she has a C-spot." "A C-spot?" "Yeah, C-spot for confessions." "That's her C-spot working," said Ross. When I read that, I thought I was going to vomit. And I felt like that moment when you're wanting to start to cry, but it's out of just complete anger and rage. Because the things that I had read and the things that I was beginning to see, and to think that, how they lied to us. And here he was, making crude jokes like it was nothing. Terry Holland was their witness. And Tommy Ward and Carl Fontenot were still in prison partly because of that witness. And, her timely layovers in the county jail. And Ross's reference to Terry Holland's C-spot, told me everything that I felt like I need to know about who he was. And again, I didn't know what to do with any of this information. And all the things that I had read just continued to scroll through my mind over and over. And I went over the conversation again, with Peppy and what I'd read in the book and the court TV interview. And now this added fact that, one of the most famous authors was going to be writing a book about Williamson. But what bothered me still was that most of the people who were going to be talking about her didn't even know her. And that her family was completely in the dark about all this that had happened. And there were many nights that I couldn't sleep. And one of these nights, I'd gotten up to just watch TV for a little bit, and I landed on Larry King Live. And I can count on the times, like on one hand, that I've ever watched Larry King. But the interview, it was a little bit underway, and I happened to, just kind of sit and watch who the guest was. And King announced that his guest was a man by the name of Kirk Bloodsworth, who was the first DNA exoneree to be released off of death row in the entire country. And I was stunned. I was a little creeped out. Kind of that feeling like, here's your sign. And Mr. Bloodworth told his story of how he was tried and convicted for a 1984 rape and murder of a 9-year-old by the name of Dawn Hamilton in Baltimore, Maryland. And the show ended, and I really still had, no idea what to do with any of this information that I had gotten. But I knew I needed to know more about Debbie's case and what had happened. And I decided that maybe the best place to start would be with the Innocence Project. Years later, I met Kirk, and he reminded me of like a younger version of Santa Claus. He had little, round glasses and wavy, like snow white hair. And he's probably over 6 feet tall, and he has big, broad shoulders. And you can see the former Marine that he was at, one day. But his physical size does not match the powerful voice that he has, and, this humbling, giving heart that he has. And in 2003, the DNA kit in Kurt's case was tested against the CODIS system, the same one that Glenn Gore's was tested in. And there was a match in 9-year-old Dawn's case to a man by the name of last name Ruffner. And he confessed to Dawn's rape and murder. And Kurt realized that he had spent 5 of 9 years in the same prison with that man, which is just astonishing. But again, I felt like as Debbie's family member, we should know as much or more about what happened in her case than anyone else. And so that morning after I had watched the Larry King interview, I decided I would just call the Innocence Project. And, I've thought for a long time, like, what am I going to say to these people? This is insane. So I remember when I called, the automatic system, says if you'd like to speak to Barry Scheck or Peter Neufeld or Maddie DeLone, dial, press whatever number. And I just thought, well, I guess there's no place better than to start than at the top. So I pressed the number for Barry Scheck. And a young receptionist answered the phone. And I took a deep breath and I said, this is Christy Shepard, and I would like to speak to Barry Scheck. And she's like, yes, ma'am, can I tell him what this call is in regard to? And I went on to explain. I said, well, I know this is going to sound really strange, but I'm the cousin of the victim in the Ron Williamson Dennis Fritz case, and I would like to speak to him about the evidence that was found. And the receptionist paused, and you could almost kind of hear the wheels turning, like she didn't know what to do with this call. And she was really sweet and said, yes, ma'am, and asked me if she could put me on hold. And I was kind of surprised. I was like, sure. And I wasn't sure where I was going to go from that, point. But a lady by the name of Maddie DeLone answered my call. And she explained that she was the executive director at the Innocence Project. And she understood that I was the cousin of the victim in the case, and that I was wanting to speak to Barry. And, I thought for a minute, wow, okay, executive director, that'll work. It's somewhere to start for sure. And I told her yes, and that I know, this sounded really crazy. And I remember telling her, I know you can't tell me or, give me the answer for the things that I'm about to ask you because of attorney-client privilege. And so I said, I really don't know where we go from here, but I know you can't answer this, but I don't know where else to start, in that I want to know what you all know happened to Debbie Carter. And we talked for quite a while, and I want to say we talked maybe a couple of different times. And Maddie was really sweet, and she speaks in just such this pleasant tone. And she was very genuine and understanding about what I was asking for. And at some point, she put me in contact with a victim advocate out of Wisconsin, who we'll talk a lot more about later. But I had really gotten into this habit of staying up through the night and, reading and kind of falling into different things. And I would get a few hours of sleep, get up, take my kids to school, daycare, I would see clients all day, family activity stuff, put my kids to bed, and then I would again fall kind of back into these internet rabbit holes. I would look up words I didn't understand. I would, look up different studies on false confessions and jailhouse snitches, and I was both intrigued and completely overwhelmed. Because this wasn't anything that I had learned even at the college level in my criminal justice classes. And I really kind of just threw myself into the deep end of the ocean trying to understand how and why this had happened in Debbie's case. But by the end of the summer of 2005, it was happening again. And the headline was that Gore gets new trial. And I remember reading this headline and feeling a physical ache in my chest that this was all going to start over, and that Peppy would have to endure all that she had before, now for the fourth time. And the Court of Criminal Appeals had overturned the death row conviction of Glenn Gore, and the court's opinion stated, "We find the exclusion of the evidence was not harmless beyond a reasonable doubt. Accordingly, the judgment and sentence is reversed, and this case is remanded to the district court for a new trial." So, the way that I understand it is that in Glenn Gore's first trial, Judge Landreth made a ruling that Gore's attorneys couldn't present any evidence against Williamson and Fritz because they had been found innocent by DNA, which makes sense. That makes sense to me. Like, you shouldn't be able to present what would seem like false information. But the Court of Criminal Appeals disagreed with Judge Landreth and said that, in fact, they didn't, exclusion of evidence was not harmless. So they, overturned it and sent it back to district court. And we'd be going to trial again. But in this same article announcing Gore was getting a new trial was this special nugget of information, again, which we knew nothing about. And there was an insert box, like a President's Day mattress style box, that said, "Coming Sunday. Ada Evening News begins a 3-part series on the relationship of Ada City property tax increase and a lawsuit settlement between Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz for their wrongful conviction and imprisonment for the murder of Deborah Sue Carter." And the next 3 newspaper articles ran stating that property owners pay. Fritz and Williamson's settlement results in higher taxes. Your taxes part 1, property tax replenishes emergency fund. Your taxes part 2, the tax increase, not unusual procedure. And your taxes part 3, and there was this, to be continued drama that came down to the city of Ada paying $500,000 of the settlement out of an emergency fund that the city maintains. And there was, I guess, this little, I didn't know about it, but an Oklahoma law that allows cities to then replenish the fund by raising property taxes without notifying the public the tax is being assessed. So not only was the settlement amount a secret, our property taxes had been raised to pay for it. And that was a secret. And the issue of secretly raising these property taxes caused a bigger uproar in my town than Williamson and Fritz being found innocent. I mean, people went bonkers over this. And probably because still at this time, most people around town believed with all their heart and soul that Williamson and Fritz were guilty as sin. And the property tax issue probably at that time also planted this seed with people that maybe what else was being kept in the dark. So up to now, what was many times beginning just to feel like a bad joke, now we had learned that we would literally pay, in every sense of the word, we would pay for the wrongdoing. And so would the rest of the town. So the court TV interview really was this tipping point. And this interview also invoked a response from the district attorney, who for the most part had been, very quiet about Williamson, Fritz, Gore mess. And on July the 10th of 2005, there was a lengthy article ran in the paper that primarily focused on the interview of the district attorney and, what he had said with court TV. And this would really be the first time my family would see what it looked like from the perspective of Peterson since Ron had Dennis had been released. And the article opened with a quote from Peterson. "There is always a case that will follow you, and I guess this is mine." And he went on to say that Terry Holland had not received any type of plea deal for her testimony, and that Glenn Gore was not, quote, the state's star witness. He stated that the most compelling evidence came during the punishment stage of the trial, when a woman testified that Williamson had tried to rape her. And of course, the only mention of Debbie or her family was, he was quoted as saying, "It's a sad case all around. It cost these two men and their families years, and it delayed closure for the hurt Debbie Carter's, for hurt Debbie, and crap, okay. And it's a sad case all around. It cost these two men and their family years, and delayed closure for and hurt Debbie Carter's family." The article stated that while, Peterson had regrets about what happened, but that he refused to feel guilty for doing his job. And I found it interesting that Peterson had never expressed his feelings of regret to Peppy or anyone else in my family. But he was wrong that closure had been delayed. Closure is a misconception and this hoped for outcome that doesn't exist when you have a family member who has been murdered. To us, Debbie isn't a case that can just be filed away when the court proceedings were over. She will always be a part of us. She will always be that part that is missing. The article went on to say, "Many people wonder why so much attention is given to the state's correction of their error. The release of Fritz and Williamson and subsequent conviction of Glenn Gore." And it says, as the Assistant District Attorney Ross said, There's no story to a guilty guy getting convicted. As if it was only, just kind of this sensational thing, and we should just all, move on. And maybe, I don't know, maybe Mr. Ross thought no one would ever take stock that heard his C-spot, take stock in his C-spot comment. Or maybe even make note of the gross mishandling of Debbie's case. But Mr. Ross could not have been more wrong. Now that we've gotten through several episodes, I would really like to invite you to ask questions that you might have. And you're welcome to send those questions to defendingthelion@gmail.com. And I'll go through and answer them the best that I can, like in a follow-up episode. In the next episode, we'll get into how stumbling into some more of this information would add more layers to this unbelievable nightmare. So you can go to defendingthelion.com for other information and updates, as well as Defending the Lion on Instagram. And you can always watch these episodes on YouTube at Defending the Lion. And I thank you for listening.